So what is it? You mentioned diet. You mentioned, all of these things being, there is a genetic component, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to have to deal with these. What did you learn about our life and our lifestyles, in particular our diet, that is causing these autoimmune conditions that seem like they're just increasing all the time with everybody?
Yeah, so just to be clear, most primitive societies, um, and I say primitive, and people may get wigged out over that, but I say it in the most complimentary way possible because they seem to do way better with their health than we civilized people do. So clearly they're doing something right and we're doing something wrong. So kudos to them. Don't have autoimmune diseases. And I bought a book years ago called Western Diseases, Their Causes and Prevention by Burkitt and Trowell. And when they got into their autoimmune section, discussing their experience as physicians and doctors, they said that most of these autoimmune diseases are unknown in Africa in traditional societies, right? So something about the modern diet was causing people to start seeing these autoimmune conditions become more and more common. Now, probably the oldest autoimmune condition and one of the more interesting dietary transitions that we know of is celiac disease, right? Celiac has a clear genetic component. The people who are most likely to get it have a specific pattern, genetic pattern. But the genetic patterns are not sufficient. They have to also be eating wheat, right? Nobody who nobody has celiac unless they're also eating wheat, right? So it's the like classic gene diet interplay, right? And evidence of people getting celiac disease from eating wheat goes back 10,000 years. They found skeletons of people who have one of the things that celiac causes to happen to your body is your bones basically rot, and they can see that in analyses of old skeletons that they found. Celiac is basically caused by, it's one of the few autoimmune diseases where we know exactly what causes it. There's a amino acid called 33-mer, which was introduced into the wheat genome by crossing it with a plant called goat grass. The benefit of goat grass to wheat and to humans is that it is much more resistant to pests, okay? And this 33-mer amino acid is the mechanism by which goat grass is able to protect itself against pests. And unfortunately for humans, we're a pest, right? So what happens is this enzyme causes, or this amino acid causes an autoimmune reaction in the gut. It changes the constitution of proteins in the gut and makes your body think that the gut is alien. And in both insects and in humans, what happens is this causes the lining of the gut, which typically has these finger-like cilia. It causes a growth in between the cilia such that the cilia aren't exposed anymore. And that means you're unable to absorb food and can, of course, ultimately kill you, right? So we know exactly what's happening here. We know where it came from. We know when it was introduced into the human food supply, when we crossed einkorn, the original form of wheat, with goat grass. That's happened a couple of times in the course of agriculture. And we know exactly how this disease progresses. So is that the only situation where this happens, right? No, it's not. There's another case that we're all very familiar with. Surprisingly, 20% of the population can actually eat poison ivy and not have a reaction to it, right? Now, poison ivy, hence the name. We're all familiar with it, doesn't require any explanation. You don't add it to your salad. How does that work? Well, in poison ivy, it's not an amino acid, it's a fat. It's a fat that alters the cell membranes and causes your body to think that it is a pathogen. And the body then attacks the pathogen, right? One of the more interesting parallels between celiac disease and poison ivy is there's a manifestation of celiac disease called dermatitis herpetiformis, and it looks like a poison ivy rash on your skin, right? So something that you are eating causes a skin rash that looks like poison ivy and is a similar, it's a little bit different from poison ivy. Poison ivy is caused by contact, obviously. We know how that works. Dermatitis herpetiformis, because it's coming from the inside out, typically happens symmetrically on the body and there's like a pattern to it. But if you have this rash, it is diagnostic of celiac disease, right? That's how good a correlation we have between that aspect of celiac disease and what causes it, which is, the genetic background and the consumption of wheat. So,
Wow.
So then we'd start getting into, are there any other polyunsaturated fats in our diet that might cause this sort of reaction? Now, what's really interesting is that, lots of plants have varying degrees of saturated and unsaturated fats. The more polyunsaturated fats you find in poison ivy, the more immunogenic it is, right? The stronger it acts as an antigen. And then we start looking at vegetable oils. Seed oil is one of my favorite topics, where we also see this wide variation in the polyunsaturated fat content of different seeds. I mean, olive oil, for instance, pretty healthy food, generally regarded as such, can have a variation of from 2% to 21% polyunsaturated fat just by normal variation between different varieties of olives and different growing conditions can cause a big change in the amount of polyunsaturated fat in the olive oil. Now, how does that tie into autoimmunity? Well, when cardiologists were trying to nail down exactly what caused heart disease, they discovered their initial hypothesis was that, of course, we've all heard LDL causes heart disease. And they were trying to figure out that Brown and Goldstein, the guys who discovered the LDL receptor and got a Nobel Prize for it, after they had done that, they said, okay, well, the first step of atherosclerosis that we're aware of is white blood cells, a type known as macrophages, convert into what we call foam cells, right? And in the course of being a foam cell, they become engorged with cholesterol and fats. And their hypothesis was that they're getting all of this from consuming LDL in the body. And so they did an in vitro experiment where they combined LDL and macrophages and said, this will create foam cells. But it didn't work. Okay, that's a problem for your hypothesis. So then they realized that if you modified the LDL, that would cause the macrophages to hoover up sufficient quantities of this modified LDL to become foam cells, right? And then some other cardiologists, Steinberg and Whitstone, discovered exactly what the modification was. And it was the oxidation of the omega-6 fatty acids in the LDL, which cause it to become modified in such a way that macrophages will hoover it up and become bone cells, right? So this is boilerplate basic cardiology at this point. This is from research done in the 1970s and the 1980s. It's never been overturned. The latest European Atherosclerosis Society consensus statement on what causes cardiovascular disease blames LDL, and then references the paper from Steinberg and Whitstone titled Beyond Cholesterol, where they describe their series of research experiments showing that, omega-6 fats becoming oxidized are what is required to induce atherosclerosis, and that if you switch, from both in animals and humans, if you switch from a fatty acid rich in fat rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids to something like olive oil that's got less of it, that you make LDL resistant to becoming oxidized. That's essentially the only story that we have in cardiological science at this point, as to what causes heart disease. And there are various different pathways by which that can happen, right? I mean, oxidation of polyunsaturated fats can be triggered by smoking or by infection. So Steinberg and Whitstone went on and they kept doing research on this, and they discovered that they found an antibody that would attach to fats in the body. You know, the cell membrane is composed of fats primarily and proteins. And what they discovered was an antibody that would bind to the cell membrane when it had become oxidized, when these polyunsaturated fats had become oxidized. And then they discovered something that's really fascinating, right? They discovered that it also binds to staph, right? The Staphylococcus aureus is one of the most common pathogens on humans. Every single one of us has it living in our skin, and it's what causes, you know, the MRSA is a type of staph infection that, you know, is resistant to antibiotics. It's a very, you know, it's one of the most common pathogens, so common that, you know, we have a germline level antibody, meaning an antibody that's hard-coded into our genes to protect us from this pathogen. And when you get oxidized omega-6 fats in your body can't distinguish it from a pathogen infection. Right?
And
So there's our link between autoimmune diseases and food. It's very simple. It alters your body in such a way that your body thinks it is itself a bacterial infection, right? And you see this in type 2 diabetes. I've found a great paper recently where they took a protein out of staph and they gave it to mice over a period of time chronically, and they discovered that it made the mice type 2 diabetic, made them insulin resistant, right? And in humans, we see that type 2 diabetes is typically preceded by oxidized LDL, you know, up to 10 years ahead of time. In a primate model, they discovered that if they gave them an antibody to oxidized LDL, it would improve their insulin resistance, you know. So essentially what we're looking at is diseases, common diseases like type 2 diabetes, common chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease are essentially an autoimmune condition, which is why you see increased levels of white blood cells, macrophages attacking tissue, trying to protect the body, right? Misinterpreting oxidized omega-6 fats as a bacterial infection. And the outcome of that, like in type 2 diabetes, you know, insulin resistance and hyperglycemia are a standard part of your body's immune repertoire, right? In sepsis, which is an extreme form of infection, your body becomes insulin resistant and hyperglycemic because those are two tools that it uses to help defend itself against infections. And we've managed to recreate that environment through common food items that you can get at your supermarket.